Welcome to Lecture 4 on Alien Minds. So today we're looking at the movie Arrival and how the aliens in Arrival, how we should understand the aliens in Arrival. And here's a image depicting one of the aliens and the language that they, at least the depiction of their language and symbols that we see in the movie. So we're going to think about a few questions that arise in the movie today. One is, could you learn an alien language? That's one question. And another question is, could learning that alien language alter your perception of time, as seems to be the case in the movie? Secondly, we might ask about the aliens themselves. Would those aliens be super intelligent? That is, would they have intelligence that is in some respect greater than the intelligence that humans possess? And third, would aliens be conscious? And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by consciousness in this case. So let's get started with just a quick sketch of Arrival here. So Arrival came out in 2016, starring Amy Adams, the female protagonist. And it's based on a story by Ted Chiang called Story of Your Life. And we're going to read some stories by Ted Chiang later in the quarter. Ted Chiang is probably the greatest living sci-fi short story writer. Definitely, I think, among short story writers, he's very good. And both, he actually has several volumes on that contain short stories. All of them are quite good. But Story of Your Life was adapted for Arrival. So one question that we want to address today is, could learning an alien language alter your perception of time? So the heptapods, the aliens in Arrival, have a very complicated looking language. And in fact, when you first see it, you're kind of skeptical that it's even a language. Or at least you could be skeptical that it's even a language. It just looks like an ink blot. Or it almost looks like when a squid ejects ink, that's what this looks like. But it turns out that this is a very complicated system of communication that is linguistic. So what are the linguistic differences in Arrival? Well, I mean, take an English sentence that appears in the movie, "There is no time, many become one," and compare it to the symbols that express this idea. In fact, I think this idea, if I'm not mistaken, this string of English translates a single ink blot from Arrival. So these two sentences are somehow encoded in this, and there's a lot of information here. So what are some differences? What is it? Heptapod ink signs or ink blots are more informationally dense than a sentence. And we come to learn that throughout the movie, that there are these little tendrils in these blots that are super complicated and that have a lot of information in them. Another differentiating feature is that heptapod ink signs are produced all at the same time. So the heptapod sort of just does one of these, and the ink just coalesces into a sign. And it does so as opposed to sequentially, like when we're typing on a computer. Even if we're not typing English, even if we're typing Chinese or Hebrew or anything like that, we're still typing sequentially. And it's only when we complete the sequence that we've expressed a complete thought. And thirdly, heptapod ink signs are circular. So they actually have this they have a circular shape, which on the one hand has sort of a metaphorical meaning, and the metaphor is probably the idea that time is a circle. So if you've seen these pictures of snakes eating their tails, this symbol tends to indicate eternity or timelessness. So those are one feature of the signs. But I mean, they're also supposed to be like a metaphorical contrast with the linearity of written languages that we're most familiar with. Chinese, Hebrew, English, all involve this sort of linear writing style, whereas these signs are much different. They circle around. All right, so let's review a little semantics. So remember our good old friend, the triangle of reference, we have symbols like English words or German words or Chinese symbols. Then we have thoughts that are symbolized by those symbols. And finally, we have the reference to which those thoughts refer and that those symbols stand for. Okay, so there's like the three things we need to have in mind when we're thinking about how thought latches onto the world and how language latches onto the world. So we're asking a question right now about how language can impact our thoughts. And this is how we should map it onto the triangle of reference. So on the one hand, you have thought or reference, which corresponds to thought. And then you have language, which corresponds to the symbols and syntax of those symbols in language. So when we make this distinction between language and thought, we can ask an interesting question, which is, to what extent does language influence thought? And a famous hypothesis in the 20th century, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or the linguistic relativity hypothesis, claims that there is a substantive way in which language influences thought. And on the strong version, language determines thought. That is, language is responsible for the essential features of thought, and linguistic categories limit and determine cognitive categories. So that's a very strong thesis. Contrast that with a much more weak thesis, the idea that linguistic categories and usage influence thought and decisions. And of course, you can influence thought without determining everything about thought. And it's worth noting that the strong version is very rarely defended. And in fact, it's hard to even find somebody who's ever really defended it, even Whorf or Sapir themselves, and really only certain sentences that they write seem to suggest the stronger idea. But the weak version could itself be interesting. It would be the idea that some of our languages impact how we think. And in Arrival, this seems to be happening. So Dr. Banks learns the heptapod language. There's a montage where she figures it all out. And consequently, Dr. Banks experiences future and past events differently. Her thoughts change. She has thoughts of the past and the future that she would not have had without the heptapod language. Without learning the heptapod language, she would not have the thoughts of the future and the past that she comes to have. So is this a case, and are the makers of the movie subscribing to a strong linguistic relativity thesis? It doesn't seem like they necessarily are, because, it could be the case that some of Dr. Banks's thoughts occur independently of, say, the heptapod language. Maybe some of Dr. Banks's thoughts occur independently of the English language. Maybe some of Dr. Banks's perceptions occur independently of any of the languages she knows. And if that's the case, then we don't need to really subscribe to the strong linguistic relativity thesis. But even then, the weak linguistic relativity thesis would still be really important and controversial. The question in Arrival would be this: could something as basic as your awareness of time be different if you speak a different language? So maybe everything else is not influenced by the language you speak. Maybe everything else about Dr. Banks's mind is not changed by her having learned the heptapod language. But maybe her awareness of time is different. And if that's true, then that's really a major finding. That's really a major claim, because then the way she perceives the past and the future are different. And that's, as we see in the movie, a pretty dramatic change. So there maybe are two different ways we might respond to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or the linguistic relativity hypothesis. One psychologist, cognitive scientist, who is in favor of a form of linguistic relativity is Lara Boroditsky. And actually, Boroditsky works at UC San Diego. And I'm not just choosing her because she works here, but she is in fact one of the primary researchers working on this topic in the world, as is evidenced by the fact that The Economist asked her to have the debate. So here's something she writes in the debate that we read. Here's one rule of thumb. If a distinction is habitually made in language, it will be made in thinking. If a distinction is not made in language, all bets are off. People may pick it up some other way or they may not. Having a word confers benefits in memory and reasoning and helps us pull apart overlapping representations to make more precise distinctions. She motions to some evidence from Finnish pronouns, which tend to constrain. Finnish children tend to make gender differentiation much later in their development than other children who have gendered pronouns. So Finnish pronouns are not gendered. And for that reason, Boroditsky hypothesizes, they make gender differentiations later in their development. But notice, like, they still make them. They just don't make them as early. Okay, so this is a case where she's not subscribing to the strong linguistic relativity hypothesis, where, you know, that would be the idea that, like, if the pronouns didn't encode gender, maybe, then you wouldn't be able to talk about gender or something like that. Similarly, the base 10 system in languages and in Mandarin, for example, might facilitate calculation, but I mean, it's not, might facilitate calculation, might facilitate counting, but it's not the only way you could come to learn how to count. Okay, so one thing that's important to notice here is that, is this rule stating a necessary and sufficient condition on a given distinction made in our thoughts? So you might, on the one hand, wonder, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for making a distinction in your thought? Say, making just a conceptual distinction between red and blue. What's required for that? Well, Boroditsky is not claiming, at least in this passage, she's not claiming that a necessary condition on distinguishing red from blue is that you have a linguistic distinction between red and blue. That's not what she's claiming. What she's claiming in this passage is that if you distinguish linguistically between red and blue, that tends to be sufficient for making a distinction between red and blue in your thoughts. Okay, that's what she's saying when she says, if a distinction is habitually made in language, it will be made in thinking, generally. And then what she's saying, though, is that if a distinction is not made in language, then we don't know what will happen. A strong linguistic relativist would have said something else. They would have said, if a distinction is not made in language, then it will not be made in thinking. And that is not what Boroditsky is claiming. Okay. And then she says that in English, the future is ahead and the past is behind. And the Elmira place the future behind them, sort of metaphorically, and the past in front of them, metaphorically, both in the way they talk and the way they gesture. In Mandarin, the past could be above and the future below. Even how a language is written matters, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of different ways in which the way we use language is reflected. And she notes that, I mean, time goes east to west for some language users. And for the cook, when they face south, time goes left to right. When they face north, it goes right to left. So they have a much different way of spatializing their representation of time. Okay? And then she writes, once we have gotten a system, we tend to stick to it. We are creatures of habit. Most English speakers have never thought of the past as being in front of them. And when they hear about it, it seems viscerally wrong. Okay? So it seems like at least the way we conceptualize time differs between different languages. At least the way we analogically or metaphorically represent time is different. Mark Lieberman wants to push back against some of the claims that Boroditsky makes, although as we see by the end of the debate, there's a lot of agreement that they both have, particularly in the fact that they both reject the sort of strong determinist hypothesis. And Lieberman notes that almost everything can influence perception, like my past experiences, where I was raised, even maybe what language I speak can influence my perception. The question is the matter of degree of influence. And then Lieberman distinguishes between merely being nudged to have a certain kind of perception versus all-out linguistic relativism, which doesn't just nudge you, but in fact determines some of your perceptions. And then Lieberman then kind of dunks on Worf. He says, according to Worf himself, speakers of any specific language are constrained to certain modes of interpretation even while they think themselves most free, to such an extent that the various grand generalizations of the Western world, such as time, velocity, and matter, are not essential to the construction of a consistent picture of the universe, but instead are mere rationalizing techniques elaborated from the patterns of a few recent dialects of the Indo-European family. And notice this quote from Worf is kind of damning because it suggests that language doesn't just influence, but actually constrains the modes of interpretation we have in thought, or the modes of thinking. And Lieberman rightly pushes against that. So how do we resolve this? As you saw on the economist debate, the House voted that they were in favor of the proposal. That was, they were in favor of Boroditsky's defense of at least a weak linguistic relativity. I mean, one question, though, again, with a specific question we have from Arrival is, can linguistic cues alter how time is experienced in particular? And it turns out that, at least based on this study and other studies like it, that it's sort of complicated. On the one hand, there is a way in which speakers in different languages, so people that speak different languages, do have similar temporal discriminations in certain circumstances. So in this study, I won't go into the details, but there was two conditions. One in which there were cues that emphasize the language you speak. That was one condition. And in another condition, those cues were suppressed. Okay? And in both conditions, individuals were asked to make temporal discriminations. One using the language cues, and one not using language cues. And it turns, a finding in this study was that when the linguistic cues were suppressed, the speakers of different languages had very similar temporal discriminations. So that suggests that if you are not using language to make the discrimination, then actually there's some background capacity that's shared between speakers of different languages, and they make similar temporal discriminations. So that might suggest that there's an innate or more fundamental representation of time that could be molded by language, even though language is not originally responsible for generating that representation of time. So as a note, I mean, when we do use linguistic cues to discriminate times, we do make different discriminations in different languages, okay? So it's a really qualified result, at least that this study suggests. So it seems then like, could Dr. Banks have had different perceptions or different, a totally different conceptualization of time just by learning a new language? Well, it doesn't seem like that is so obvious based on this study, okay? So we still have to do a little bit more. We still have to do a little bit more philosophy to figure out what to say about Dr. Banks. So what about heptapod time? Okay. What about the good old heptapods? So it seems implausible that we can learn how native speakers of a language perceive the world merely by learning their language. So I'm just, this is a little bit of this is opinionated, but some of this is making distinctions that I think are important for understanding the film and understanding how it relates to the linguistic relativity hypothesis. So, I mean, like, is it really the case that just when Dr. Banks learns how these symbols are used, and when Dr. Banks learns how to speak the heptapod language, she thereby becomes a heptapod perceiver? That seems wrong. Like, she probably doesn't have the perceptual organs that the heptapods have, assuming they have perceptual organs, which they seem to have. That seems wrong. So if Dr. Banks lacks those organs, how could she all of a sudden perceive the world in the same way they do? Well, maybe the idea is, well, she can still have a similar temporal perception to how the heptapods, to the one that the heptapods have. But even then, it's why would that be the case? Why would the radically non-perspectival kind of eternal way that the heptapods perceive time, or at least the way they would express time in their language, why would that rub off onto Dr. Banks? So here we need to make a distinction. We need to distinguish conceptualizing time from perceiving time. Okay? So, like, we're able to conceptualize time eternally too. We can use tenseless verbs. It rains, for example, is tenseless. It rains could suggest that it's raining now. It could just be it could be a state of affairs that could happen anytime. But when I say it is raining now, that suggests that it's raining at the present time. Or if I said it was raining, that means it is no longer raining, but in the past it rained. And then I can of course say it will rain, which means it will in the future it rains. Okay, but those are all ways of expressing time in language. They're all different ways of conceptualizing time. But does that mean that I'm going to perceive time differently? Maybe not. So the heptapod concept of time, that at least as it's expressed in their language, seems to be eternal and not indexed to any present. That's what I mean by saying it's tenseless. It's not just like it was raining or it will rain, or that it is raining now, but it rains, a sort of tenseless way of expressing things. Or it was or will be, it's just that it is, sort of a very tenseless way of stating things. So we might ask then, like, does their perception privilege the present? So even though heptapods have a weird eternal concept of time, they might still perceive the present just like we do. They might have a very similar perception of the present. And if they do, then they would have a very similar perception to what the humans have. And like even moreover, the second point, it might be the case that their scientific instruments or artificial intelligence is so good that they just incorporate the predictions that those instruments give them, that those improved scientific instruments give them, into their conceptualization of temporal events, even though they still perceive the present much like we do. So if they expand their perceptual repertoire beyond what they individually have, then of course they might all of a sudden know that the world comes to an end in 20 billion years, and they might incorporate that into their conceptualization of time. But that's not the same thing as saying that they perceive the end of the world in 20 billion years. Okay, it might just be that they are able to make such predictions. So the Anglophone or human concept of time, and I mean, I say this Anglophone just as a hedge, but I mean, I think the human concept of time would be something that is generally pretty linear and viewed from a particular moment. But the question is, even if different humans conceptualize time differently, do they really perceive temporal events differently? Or are there core similarities between humans? So again, like, we can conceptualize eternity like this, or we can conceptualize the world from a God's eye view like this, but it doesn't mean we perceive it that way. Similarly, the heptapods might conceptualize it this way, but do they really perceive? They don't really perceive this, do they? Or what would that mean? So to sum up, could learning an alien language alter your perception of time? Well, we distinguish between conceptualizing and perceiving time, and it seems like this distinction casts out that we actually perceive time differently, although I'm open to those of you who wish to push back on this. And then there's also a distinction between strong and weak linguistic relativism, and we thought that, well, the strong version seems implausible, and if anything is true, it would just be the weaker linguistic relativism. And then finally, we looked at some evidence regarding linguistic relativism between human linguistic communities. But an outstanding question that we still haven't answered is, humans seem to have some things in common. That's what the study I showed suggested, but we still don't know how it would work between totally different life forms. Is it really going to be the case that we could share thoughts between us and the heptapods? I kind of assumed that, but it's not so obvious. Okay, so the second question we're going to look at today is, would aliens be super intelligent? So this is a picture from the movie Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the 2005 film, based on a comic book and book. It's a comic series, I guess. It's actually very complicated. Anyway, by Douglas Adams. It's based on a book by Douglas Adams called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And Deep Thought is this huge AI that allegedly has answers to things like what the meaning of life is. And we'll look at Deep Thought's answer to what the meaning of life is on the last day of class. For those of you who've seen the movie, you'll know that this is a huge joke. Okay, so are the heptapods super intelligent? Okay. So notice the question we're asking is, would aliens be super intelligent? Okay. Well, there are reasons to think that they're sort of smart. In fact, that they're smarter than us. One is that they have like anti-gravity properties in the access tunnel. So we don't have that yet. That's pretty cool, but seemingly very difficult. They have a very sophisticated language. And one thing that's odd is it's not so sophisticated that that a trained linguist can't figure it out, but it's still very sophisticated. Okay. And importantly, for the argument that follows, these aliens are able to travel long distances in space. So that suggests that they're super intelligent. And then like these ships are pretty cool. This is my own point, but like they kind of balance wherever they are. They're not like any ships that we've ever made. They're kind of these balancing pods. So these all suggest that these heptapods got a lot of things together intellectually. So the question though is, so there seems to be some evidence for the idea that the heptapods are super intelligent. A follow-up question would be, will these aliens, like the heptapods, would they be super intelligent artificial intelligence? Okay. So in the film, it's unclear exactly what kind of beings the heptapods are, but we can ask, would beings like the heptapods, if they visited Earth, would those beings be super intelligent artificial intelligence, or would they be biological intelligence or non-artificial intelligence? So Schneider, in the chapter we read for today, thinks that the most sophisticated civilizations will be post-biological forms of AI. She notes, some arguments for why we would think that most aliens would be super intelligent artificial intelligence. At least aliens that come into contact with us. One is the short window of observation argument. So this is very simple. It's the idea that if you can get in touch with the cosmos, then you will soon be able to switch from biological to AI paradigms. So this is at least true for the aliens that we would ever come in contact with. If, like the heptapods, aliens could travel so far and get in contact with us, then surely they could also go the extra small step of developing artificial intelligence and endowing that artificial intelligence with super intelligence. And in fact, you might think that we're going to be on this track ourselves eventually, where there's humans, or which Schneider calls naturals, and then humans are able to then do this neural implantation. So notice here, this is what we saw last week with what was it? We were talking about auto and neural implants. Well, this human, if this is a if this is a memory bank that has a neural interface, then this human is a cyborg, as Schneider says. This is already a cyborg, not a cyborg with many implants, but it's a cyborg because it has at least one intellectually important implant. And then you might think then, well, after the cyborg, eventually we could become so advanced that we don't just have cyborg humans, but in fact we have post-humans, that is, beings who shed most of their biological trappings and assume an artificial form. Okay, what's another argument for the claim that most aliens would be super intelligent, artificial intelligence? Well, notice that this was an argument for the claim that they will be artificial intelligence. Okay, so this is an argument for the claim that the aliens will be artificial intelligence. What about the claim that they will be super intelligent artificial intelligence? Well, this argument that Schneider gives is the idea that the greater age of alien civilizations will endow them with this super intelligence. So we are probably galactic babies, so we're not a good sample, Schneider says. We're no more than a few million years old. Actually, I guess Homo sapiens are no more than 1 million years old. And if alien life has developed before us, it probably did so millions of years ago. And even if it's a few million years older than us, it's got to be way smarter than us. That's Schneider's bet. And if it's billion years older than us, then it's got to be way smarter than us. And that would give them years to develop AI and super intelligent artificial intelligence. Moreover, she notes, they will likely not be carbon-based because silicon is much more efficient for information processing. So this is a picture of the Nickelodeons from Futurama. This is actually, so Matt Groening is the creator of Futurama, but apparently Matt Groening thinks that Schneider is wrong because the Nickelodeons are super intelligent aliens, but they are not artificial intelligence, at least based on my knowledge of Futurama. In fact, they're furry, and they're described as the cutest beings in the universe. So the Nickelodeons, the joke goes in Futurama, they're 14 minutes older than the beginning of the universe. So they're really old, but they're somehow biological looking. So anyway, Schneider's going to say that no, the Nickelodeons would never be like this. Or if there was an alien life form that is super intelligent like the Nickelodeons and really old, and therefore very old, they're not going to be furry. They're going to be probably made of silicon. Okay. All right, and we might then ask here for what form would the intelligence take in these cases? And Schneider distinguishes artificial intelligence based on the etiology or the source of those artificial intelligences. So human AI might be different from alien AI, for example. So here's an example of human AI, and these are both from the video game Halo. For those of you who've played, this is a first-person shooter video game, an absolute classic for the Xbox. Okay, so human AI, like Cortana, would maybe look like this. And notice Cortana has also been adapted for the Windows operating system. So, because Windows bought Xbox, Microsoft owns Xbox, and Microsoft started to use the Cortana brand in Windows. So there you go. And if we had human AI, it might look a lot like this. It might, for example, Cortana has empathy for people for other humans. Cortana tries to gauge the emotions of other humans. And she does so in a way that seems very human. Moreover, maybe it looks like Cortana has got eyes, and assuming these are eyes that are actually sensing the environment and not just pretend eyes, it seems like she would use visual imagery to gain information about the world. If so, then this human AI is going to inherit a lot of the features of humans. And we can contrast this with alien AI, like 343 Guilty Spark from the Forerunners. 343 Guilty Spark was a character in the original Halo. And 343 Guilty Spark is super intelligent and obviously artificial, but lacks a lot of the features that Cortana has. For example, 343 Guilty Spark is not the most moral person. 343 Guilty Spark tries to eliminate the human race, and has a very calculating, unempathic view of what he should do. And visual imagery, there's this little light, but it's totally possible that this alien will not involve any sort of visual input. And if so, whoever the Forerunners were, were likely very different from humans. Okay. So all that to say, we really don't know what the intelligence would look like in both these cases, and it might be the case that they would inherit a lot of the features of the non-super intelligent intelligence that, in our case, is biological. Okay. All right, so, and the last point for today is, the last question for today would be, would aliens be conscious? This is going to help us segue a little bit into our discussion of personal identity next week. So this is a picture of Ava from Ex Machina. So Ava, for those of you who have not seen this movie, it's a very good movie. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to watch it. You should watch it in your own time. Ava is a cyborg, I guess actually just completely artificial robot. And she, throughout the movie, one of the questions that the movie poses is whether Ava has any moral standing, whether we should treat Ava like other humans or whether we should treat Ava like a computer. And one of the reasons you might think we should treat Ava like a human is that she's conscious. Because people tend to think, well, if you're conscious, you can feel pain, you can feel pleasure, and once you got pain and pleasure, or once you have awareness, then you're already off to the races in having moral standing. Okay? So remember we talked last week about intentionality, and we distinguished it from phenomenality. Intentionality deals with the content, aboutness, or representationality of mental states, whereas phenomenality deals with the qualitative felt character of a mental state. It's the what it's like of the mental state. So today we're going to ask, or we're going to, revisit the question, which of these are the mark of the mental? Or both, or neither? And importantly, would alien minds have either or both? Because if aliens have minds, then that'd be a good test case to see which of these are the mark of the mental. So if aliens aren't conscious, then, and they're just merely intentional beings, then maybe it turns out that phenomenality is not required to have a mind. Or, we're not going to ask so much today whether intentionality is required or not. We're going to kind of assume it. But that would be another question you could ask. Do you need intentionality, or is mere brute feeling enough? And like I said before, like another question you might ask is, well, maybe both of these happen together, but which one of these is more fundamental? In other words, does intentionality depend on phenomenality, or does phenomenality depend on intentionality? And if you're interested in those kind of questions, we're not going to discuss them in this course, but you could take our upper division course on philosophy of mind, which is offered roughly every other year by usually Jonathan Cohen or Matt Fulkerson. All right. So what can we do with this distinction? Well, we could imagine a being with intentionality, or at least a being that seems to have beliefs, or a being that behaves a lot like it has beliefs, but that nevertheless lacks phenomenality. It lacks phenomenal character. It lacks consciousness as we understand it. So these beings would be philosophical zombies. And philosophical zombies are exactly like us in all physical respects, except for one thing: they lack conscious experiences. They lack consciousness. And by definition, there is nothing it is like to be a zombie because they have no conscious experiences. Yet zombies behave just like us, and some even spend a lot of time discussing consciousness. Read that again. Yeah, these unconscious beings behave so much like us that they spend time discussing this thing called consciousness. And then some questions philosophical philosophers ask about this are, would P-zombies, philosophical zombies, have minds? Would they have beliefs? Would they have intentional states? And if they can have beliefs but without consciousness, then that shows that beliefs are independent of consciousness. If they can have intentional states without consciousness, then that shows that intentional states don't depend on consciousness. There are actually a lot more questions that we can ask. But before we ask those questions, I want you to be very clear. This is a zombie. This is not a philosopher zombie. This is a zombie. The ones that eat your brain and all that stuff. This is not what philosophers are talking about. And dramatic unveil. This is the zombie we're talking about. Okay? So this individual on the right-hand side is a P-zombie. This is what we're talking about. This individual would think and continue thinking, or at least they would say that, and they would run away when they saw, danger. But they lack a what it's like. And even though everything is physically the same between this philosophical zombie and her conscious counterpart, she lacks consciousness. So notice, you can't try to diffuse the situation by saying, well, look, we can just look inside of her brain and do an fMRI and determine whether or not she's conscious, because she's going to have the exact same fMRI profile as a conscious person would. The difference between her and a conscious person is that she lacks consciousness, okay? She's exactly physically like a conscious person, except she lacks consciousness. So, okay, why should we care about these things? Okay. Well, here's the point, and here's what philosophers like David Chalmers have argued. If zombies are possible, they show that a complete physical description of the world might fail to solve the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is an explanation of the what it's like of experiences. Not just the intentionality or the aboutness of them, or not just the fact that they have contents, but why it is that my experiences of red have that reddy feeling, and why my experiences of blue have the bluey feeling, and why pains feel that way, and why pleasures feel the way they do. That's the hard problem of consciousness. And the point is, well, if you could duplicate, if you could have a zombie that looks like this, that is an exact physical duplicate of a conscious person, then it can't be the case that the physical features of the person explain why the person is conscious in the way they are, right? Because there's no physical difference. Without a physical difference between the conscious and unconscious person, you can't have an explanation for consciousness. And this was what we already saw in Leibniz's Mill thought experiment, where we looked into the duck's brain and we were like, all there is a bunch of physical stuff going on, and nowhere in here can we see the consciousness happening. And it could get more fancy. You could do an fMRI of a much more complicated system, but at the end of the day, whether it's GABA or other neurotransmitters or glial cells or whatever, it's just a more complicated mill, physical interactions between parts of the brain, and nowhere will you find an explanation of consciousness. And the question is, why does all this activity give rise to phenomenal character or phenomenality? I should note, this is like one of the great philosophical questions, and so much so that there's a whole SEP article on zombies. And in philosophical surveys, these are one of the basic questions. Like, here's a basic question in philosophy. What do you think about the external world? Notice most people are not skeptics. Only 5% are skeptics about the external world, which I want to know who those people are. Free will, great questions like compatibilist. Do you think that free will is compatible with determinism? Libertarianism, we are free despite a deterministic universe. No free will or other. So like all these great questions, but you also have the zombie question. So some people think that zombies are conceivable, but not actually possible. And if that's the case, then it turns out that even though it seems like we can conceive of a being who's a physical duplicate without consciousness, it's not actually possible to have such a being. Okay. Some people think, 23% of philosophers think that they are metaphysically possible. And I guess for that reason, it's actually not possible to give a physical explanation of consciousness. And then some people think it's inconceivable. And then 25% of people are too sophisticated for this survey. Okay, so now that we have all that on board, we can ask, are the heptapods conscious? So let's just suppose that there could be an intentional system that lacked phenomenal consciousness. So I'm gonna sort of spot the heptapods, the idea that they have intentional states and beliefs, because, well, why? Well, because they have this really complicated language. And if they have this very complicated language, then they must at least have derived intentional states. They must at least have some sort of states with aboutness. Otherwise, like, it would make their communication completely magical and mysterious. And anyway, I'm just gonna assume that they have intentional states. Okay. But like, that's consistent with the possibility that the heptapods are philosophical zombies. In other words, why do they have consciousness? In contrast, and slightly different question, would forms of super intelligent artificial intelligence be P zombies? Could a super intelligent artificial intelligence be a system with intentional states, but without consciousness? Okay, so one thing I want to note about heptapods is we don't really know like what their origin is based on the movie alone. So, like, this picture here suggests that they're biological, right? I mean, this looks like a squid. This looks like a starfish. When was it Abbott, or I forgot if it was Abbott or Costello was the one who put their finger on the wall, their hand on the wall. But I mean, this looks a lot like a biological organism. And if so, then the heptapods are not artificial intelligence. So, I mean, we still might ask, like, are they zombies? Because we still don't know whether they have what's required for consciousness. But we're going to ask a slightly different question going forward. Let's suppose that the heptapods were artificial intelligence. Well, would they be zombies? One response is the following. No. Biological systems are the only systems that could be conscious. And that's the view of biological naturalism, which says that silicon-based SAI would lack consciousness and would also lack any real understanding that minds are capable of. So according to biological naturalism, and John Searle is the famous proponent of this view, consciousness is an emergent feature of certain systems of neurons in the same way that solidity and liquidity are emergent features of systems of molecules. The existence of consciousness can be explained by the causal interactions between elements of the brain at the micro level, but consciousness cannot itself be deduced or calculated from the sheer physical structure of neurons without some additional account of the causal relations between them. The important parts are these things that I highlighted. Just like liquidity is an emergent feature of the molecules of water, so too is consciousness an emergent feature of the properties of neurons. Okay? But Searle's idea is, if you changed the molecules that make up the water, you're going to get a different, if it were like a bunch of carbon, you would have coal, not liquidity anymore. Similarly, if you didn't have neurons, you would no longer have consciousness, on Searle's view. The existence of consciousness can be explained by the causal interactions between elements of the brain at the micro level, just like liquidity can be explained by the interactions between water molecules at the microscopic level. And again, the idea is, if you were to change out neurons for some other silicon thing, you would not have consciousness. Just like if you were to switch out H2O for other molecule like coal, you would no longer have liquidity. So in short, the biological details matter for consciousness, according to biological naturalism. And why should we believe this view? So Searle gives a very famous argument called the Chinese room argument. Searle supposes that he's locked in a room where he's handed a set of English rules that allow him to link one set of Chinese symbols with other Chinese symbols. So although he doesn't know Chinese, the rules allow him to respond in written Chinese to questions written in Chinese. He's essentially processing symbols. Searle concludes that although those outside of the room may think he understands Chinese, he does not understand Chinese. Similarly, a computer may appear to be having a Chinese conversation, yet it does not truly understand Chinese, nor is it conscious. So the idea is that, clearly, the guy in the room does not understand Chinese in this scenario. So to be clear, here's what's happening here. There's a slot in which and out of which there are going to be instructions strings of Chinese. Strings in Chinese are going to come in and out of this slot. If you understand Chinese, then choose some other language, okay? And then there's a guy in the room, and I'm just manipulating squiggles and squaggles to produce Chinese language behavior. I don't understand Chinese, and this rule book, in fact, is in English. So this rule book just tells me what to do in English, given the symbols in Chinese I'm given. And, the rule book might say, take a squiggle sign from basket number 1 and put it next to a squaggle sign from basket number 2, given what you're given. Okay, so it's very simple, really very simple instructions based on whatever the input is that you're getting from outside. And the idea is, in the back of Searle's mind is, well, this is a lot like a computer. A computer is just an input-output system, just like this little slot is an input-output. Well, this is the input-output. A computer involves manipulating symbols based on input, and the symbol manipulation obeys rules, just like the rules that are encoded in this huge rule book that this man is looking at. And the idea is that, well, if a computer is like this system, then just like the guy in this room doesn't understand Chinese, so too, the computer does not understand Chinese. Okay? So the metaphor here that's most apt is that between a Turing machine and this. So a Turing machine, again, is the most basic, is a very basic kind of computer. or really any computer that computes algorithms. So Turing is the one who obviously came up with this, and it's very simple. The idea is that you have a read-write head, and this read-write head either when it comes to a given entry on a piece of tape, either it preserves this entry or it erases this entry and puts in a 0. So there's two actions. You can either preserve the one or erase it and put a 0. And the rules that this head has will either preserve this, preserve it or not. We'll say that, yeah, you should erase it or you should not erase it. And moreover, it will tell the head what to do afterwards. So it will say like, erase 1 and go to position 48 and then proceed. That's very much like what this man in the room is doing. He's just, given the inputs from the outside, he's just taking the symbols out of one bin, concatenating them together, and spitting them out of the whole again. Very much like a computer. So Searle's conclusion from the thought experiment is that human minds and consciousness cannot be explained by computation. This is computation. Instead, minds result from biological processes which are not explained computationally, but instead in terms of causal relations between neuronal structures, just like we saw. So Schneider replies to this. One reply that's classic is the so-called systems reply. And the idea might be that, sure, I agree with you, Searle. You do not understand Chinese in this case. However, the room, even though the person in the room does not understand Chinese, the room, or the system as a whole, does understand Chinese. Perhaps it is implausible to say that the room understands Chinese, but it puts us on the right track, right? So maybe in this experiment, as Searle described it, the room is not understanding Chinese. Maybe that's the case. But the idea might be that if we filled out the picture differently or in greater detail, we would be on the right track because the whole system itself would understand Chinese. Another response Schneider gives is that, well, this just seems like our theory of computation seems to be a very good empirical story for how thought works. So biological naturalism identifies biological features, not computational algorithmic features, as the key items for explaining consciousness and understanding. But that seems empirically suspect because if cognitive science is correct, that thinking is computational, then humans and superintelligent artificial intelligence share a common feature. Their thinking is essentially computational. And computational features are the mark of consciousness. So if all these systems share thinking and computation together, then why would the computational structures not count as thinkers, and therefore as beings that understand the language? I mean, there's some ways to respond to Schneider's objection to biological naturalism. This is a lot to keep track of. So we're on Schneider's response to, we're looking at responses to Schneider's objections, okay? So one response is that, well, why think that computational systems suffice for consciousness? Sure, they serve as really great models for consciousness. They serve as very good models for thinking. But just because they model thinking and just because they model consciousness does not mean that those models suffice for consciousness. Okay? Because note, Schneider says that computational features are the mark of consciousness, and that suggests that she is stating a sufficient condition on consciousness. Okay? If you have computational features of a certain kind, then you're conscious. But why think that? Why think that computation suffices for consciousness? Why don't you also need biological features? Another objection or response to Schneider would be from Pigliucci, which Schneider herself notes. He states that functionalism is an implausible perspective on the nature of consciousness, and according to functionalists, the nature of mental states depend on the way it functions, or the role it plays in the system in which it is a part. Functionalism tries to explain mental features in terms of causal relations between parts of a system. Right? So, unlike biological naturalism, functionalism says, forget about the actual things that are in the relations. Forget about the actual neurons that are that constitute the brain. Just look at the causal relations between the nodes right? It doesn't matter what's actually in the nodes that are at either side of the relation. What matters are the relations themselves. And Pigliucci says, this is a problematic picture. And it's a picture that is presupposed by the computationalist view. And the objection is that functionality isn't just a result of the proper arrangement of the parts of the system, but also of the types of materials that make up those parts. So it's kind of just reverting back to Searle's original view that, just as H2O is important for explaining liquidity, so too are neurons important for explaining consciousness. Okay. Schneider tries to give some responses to this, but it's not clear that Schneider's response does much more than just say that this might be true. Schneider seems to think, well, we should look at the brain for help in research, but Schneider seems to stop short of the idea that, well, the brain doesn't matter for consciousness. So, as far as Schneider says in this paper, it's unclear that she has a very satisfying response to biological naturalism. So there are further responses to the Chinese room argument, and therefore responses to biological naturalism. One is the robot reply to the Chinese room argument, which is this idea. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The robot reply states that a digital computer in a robot body with sensory systems freed from the room could attach meanings to symbols and actually understand natural language. The robot reply, in effect, appeals to externalist semantics, and that's what we saw several times before. Even if syntax and internal connections in isolation from the world are insufficient for meaning, suitable causal connections with the world can provide content to the internal symbols. The result would be understanding of the language by a computational system. So here's the idea. What the Chinese room argument does wrong is it says that, look, the Chinese room is just like Vera having thoughts by herself. And suppose that we can make sense of Vera's thoughts entirely computationally, right? Well, the robot reply says, we agree with you, John. We agree with you, Searle. If Vera were completely causally isolated from the rest of the world and we just conceived of Vera as a computational system, then it's indeed true that Vera would not understand Chinese. But if we give Vera perceptual systems and we give Vera the capacity to move around like a robot, then Vera would be in causal relationship with the things that cause the symbols that she is looking at. And if that's the case, then her ideas would latch onto the world. So, the robot reply is essentially saying the Chinese room argument just leaves out additional details, which, if we were to put the details in, would make it possible for a computational system to be conscious. The brain simulation reply is similar, but it goes even further. And it says, listen, if we actually supposed that the program simulates the actual sequence of nerve firings that occur in the brain of a native Chinese speaker, when that person understands Chinese, every nerve, every firing, then that system would understand Chinese. So this is much more detailed. It's not just saying, you got an English rule book in front of you and that's going to be sufficient to simulate or recreate a consciousness of Chinese. It's important. It's not just a simulation of Chinese. It's not just a simulation of understanding Chinese. It's an actual understanding of Chinese. But the brain simulation reply just says, of course a computational system could be conscious, but it needs to do way more than what the Chinese room does. The Chinese room doesn't go far enough. Since the computer then works the very same way as the brain of a native Chinese speaker, processing information in just the same way, it will understand Chinese, even though it's a computational system. And the system in the Chinese room argument, says the Churchlands, so I should say first, the Churchlands subscribe to a brain simulation type reply, or at least it seems like they're consistent with this reply. And what they say is that the system in the Chinese room argument does not understand Chinese. That's correct. However, the argument's conclusion is based on an illusion. It relies on our ignorance of the detailed workings of cognitive and semantic systems, and if we were to be more sophisticated, a simulated brain would understand Chinese. Even though the parts of the simulation don't understand Chinese, the whole simulation would. So this is going to wrap up our discussion of biological naturalism, and you should, think through whether you find these arguments convincing and whether you think a computational system that's completely artificial could be intelligent, and whether it could also be conscious. Next week, we're going to think a little bit more about personal identity, and all these questions will arise again when we consider whether personal identity is a matter of biology, a matter of overlapping psychological states, or whether it's a matter of a conscious subject, or maybe it's a matter of none of these things, and we need to have a new theory. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.